Are you weary or are you wounded? Because those are not the same thing. Those are not the same thing. And if you are weary, then okay, let's talk about your schedule. Let's build in a summer break that we can figure that out. If you're wounded, you cannot sabbatical your way into healing if you're wounded.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad you joined us. Hey, what do you do when nobody trusts pastors anymore? I mean, how do you respond? How do you lead in that? Plus, we talk about the next gen church leaders' mental health crisis and the difference between being weary and being wounded. I'm unpacking all that today with Glenn Packiam. So glad to have him on the podcast. Hey, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. And for those of you who are regulars, or if you're new, maybe like this conversation and leave a comment to join it. And now, a word from today's partners, and then we'll dive into my conversation with Glenn Packiam. Today's episode is brought to you by Gloo. Well, if you're like most pastors, you're diving into AI. But the question is, how do you know whether ChatGPT is giving you accurate answers or whether they're even aligned with your doctrinal beliefs, with your values? So Gloo has been diving into AI, and Devin Klein from Gloo AI is here to tell us a little bit more. What are you doing right now with AI, Devin, for church leaders?
Yeah, thanks, Carey. At Gloo AI, we've been working really hard to build AI to serve the church and the faith community, to give them AI that aligns with their ethics, morals, and mission. Now, churches can train Gloo AI on their own documents, policies, and beliefs, so their team and congregation can get trustworthy, on-brand answers instantly. With custom AI assistants, churches can have a 24/7 digital presence on their website, engaging and serving their people whenever they need it the most.
Okay, so if you're interested in getting your church's documents, belief statements, and everything to feed into the AI you're using, all you have to do is go to ai.gloo.com. That's ai.gloo.com to get started today. Today's episode is brought to you by Belay. So what is one task you wish you could delegate today? The truth is, just because it has to get done doesn't mean you have to be the one to do it. So stop doing it all and start delegating with Belay. I just delegated a problem I had the other day to my assistant. I'll tell you, it makes a huge difference. Frees up your mental load. And for over a decade, Belay has matched busy leaders like you with the support they need to start delegating. Whether it's a virtual assistant to knock out your to-do list or an accounting professional to handle your finances, Belay's flexible staffing solutions have your right hire right now. So to get started, download Belay's free guide to delegation today, 25 Things to Stop Doing in 2025. With this resource, you can declutter your to-do list, delegate to someone you trust, and reclaim your time and focus today. Here's what you do. Text my name, Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, to 55123 for your free download. That's C-A-R-E-Y to 55123. And in no time, you'll be off doing exactly what you do best. Glenn, really good to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Carey, thank you so much, man. What an honor.
I enjoy our conversations a lot. So a softball question to get us started. Pretty easy time to be a pastor these days, isn't it? No,
man.
No. Is this actually the hardest time to be a pastor, like sort of in our effective lifetimes, or is that just hyperbole?
You know, obviously, in our effective lifetimes is the right qualifier there, Carey. I mean, I think in our recent memory, in our collective memory, it certainly does seem in that way. And in this culture,
let's not pretend to be China or, the persecuted church. Yeah.
That's right. In the West, in North America, where our context is, Carey, I think it is. And I think there's a few factors for that. I think the attitudes externally are what's changed the most dramatically. So, for example, maybe 20 years ago or so, there was kind of this militant atheism and people were out to sort of disprove any kind of God, so you have Dawkins and Hitchens and all that. I think that's quieted down quite a bit. And then it sort of shifted to an indifferent agnosticism, this sort of like, oh, I don't know, you don't know, who cares? Even that, you could work with that. I think what we have now, it's kind of confusing and complex. What we have now, I would call it a curious skepticism. So you have all of this data from Barna about curiosity and, spiritual openness. 71% of people fall in between, they're neither practicing Christians, that's 19%, nor are they naturalists, hardcore, there's no supernatural, that's only 10%. So you got 71% in the middle who would say, no, there's some kind of spiritual or supernatural. But the skepticism word is a huge part of this. It's high spiritual openness, but low institutional trust. And that's true of all institutions, whether it's the news or the government or the church. And so for a pastor, you're wrapped up, you're associated with an institution, an old institution. And even if people are spiritually open, they don't trust you to be the spokesperson for it.
So yeah, there is that decline in institutions, which has been part of postmodernism. And, being Canadian, I grew up in that. I do most of my work in the US, and I'm, permanent resident of the US, but having a lot of Canadian background, it's really interesting to me that I saw that in my childhood, so I just assumed it. But pastors were respected in the 90s and the early 2000s, and that's plummeted. But let's talk about the thing that I hear a lot about, friendly fire, or maybe it's not even friendly anymore. I mean, the number of pastors who've had to apologize for what they said, not what they did. It's not like, I slept around on my spouse, not that. I mean, that is enough in and of itself.
Yes.
But like they said the wrong thing in the sermon. We were just commenting before we started, and I won't say who it was because it'll date it, but there was a very well-known pastor, every single listener would know, who had to apologize for something that he posted on X on the weekend because both sides just jumped on him. And, he said, I wrote wrong. I sorry, that was a mistake on my part. And I think every pastor can identify with that. You say something that you don't even think is contentious and it's contentious. Like, is that a part of it? Or is my mailbox just filled with that and that's not a trend?
Well, I'm seeing it too. My mailbox is full of it too, Carey. And I think it's a combination of factors. I think the digital age is like the Wild West. So everybody's trying to carve out their own little plot of land. Everybody's trying to strike gold. Only gold in the digital age is fame and influence and number of clicks and followers. So everybody's trying to strike gold in terms of influence. And then everybody's their own sheriff, their own sort of vigilante. I'm the self-appointed theology police here. And so there is friendly fire, and there is this sense of, and then you combine it, just to go back to the credibility or the institutional trust. Let's talk about pastors. When I first did the resilient pastor research, there was about 65% or so of Christians who would have agreed that a pastor is a trustworthy voice of wisdom. I thought that was bad news because that meant a third of the people.
How long ago was that? Let's timestamp that.
So that was 2020, early 2022. We asked Americans, we said, do you consider a pastor a trustworthy source of wisdom? This is 2022. 65% said yes, at least yes, hesitantly, maybe even strongly. And I thought that was bad news. I was like, man, that means a third of our people are listening to us and going, I don't know. That number, Carey, has dropped. It's now only 45% of church-going Christians consider a pastor a trustworthy source of wisdom. Imagine
of church-going Christians, not atheists.
No, it's like 6% or of non-Christians, which that's pretty low. So the wider culture is definitely not listening, but more than half the people in our churches are listening to things we post or say and receiving it with a kind of skepticism. That's tough.
Now, you're not just a writer and a commentator and a podcast host. You're also a full-time pastor in Orange County. Let's get personal. How does that play out for you as pastor of a local church?
Out here on the West Coast, in California, it's well known, that people are into all kinds of spiritual things, whether that's microdosing on hallucinogens or whether that's crystals or whether that, everybody's chasing something and this new injection or this new thing or this new spa. I mean, I saw a thing on the local news where a rabbi was saying, actually, if we could work in some of these mushrooms into our meditation practices. I mean, it's the Wild West in a very literal way, where any kind of customizable spirituality goes, so long as A, I'm in charge of my own spirituality, and so long as B, it makes me better. So spirituality is connected with self-authoring and self-optimizing. And so then as a pastor, I feel like, hey, do I get a voice in this? Can I guide you at all? And you don't automatically have that trust or authority. Not that I'm not looking for control, I'm looking for influence. But spiritual authority is pretty hard to identify or feel like I have that out here.
So are you getting emails and DMs or public call outs from the people who go to your church about what you're saying or not saying or doing or not doing?
No, I do feel very fortunate in that, Carey. We have a really, really supportive church and amazing elders, amazing congregants and leaders, people who are genuinely leaning in, hungry for the word of God, all of that. But it's the people who are newer, who start coming, who have just started coming, which I'm grateful for. So grateful for people on the edges, leaning in. But it's those people who go, now, hang on a minute. Now, why is this the view on sexuality, or why is this the view about money or whatever that it may be? Now, it's easy when I preach a sermon about how Jesus can free you from worry or anxiety. Oh, people love that because, again, that fits into that self-optimization, kind of goal. Yeah. But if I start, and of course, inevitably, you teach through the Bible, you're going to have to talk about sin. You're going to have to talk about convicting things, and that's where
some sermons should provoke anxiety.
Yes,
if you're doing it right. If you're doing it right? Like you shouldn't feel good after this is over.
No, exactly.
Enneagram 8 preacher in me is like, I enjoyed those Sundays, maybe a little bit too much. if you upset the equilibrium.
I like that. I like that.
So what can you do to, because I agree, there's not a lot of, and some of that was institutional loyalty. I've told the story before here, so if you've heard this on some random episode 200 episodes ago, forgive me. But, I come from a long line of Dutch immigrants. My grandmother was born in Holland, moved here to Canada years ago. And when I said I was going into ministry, she was very excited. And in her Holland in the 20th century, if the pastor, the dominee, as they would say in Holland, came down the street, you stopped and you tipped your hat, and you tipped your hat at the banker, and you tipped your hat at the lawyer. And so it was, she thought it was a very esteemed profession. I'm like, oh, grandma, you don't know. But anyway, so that kind of borrowed institutional trust is gone, as it is for politicians, as it is for almost anybody representing any established authority, CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. Even healthcare workers took a big hit in the last 5 years. Yeah. Doctors aren't trusted anymore, et cetera. So there's that sort of, can we call it borrowed authority?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you need to do to establish actual authority and or credibility? Like, what are some things you could, to do or to avoid?
I think to avoid, let's start there. I think to avoid is to rely on the same sort of gimmicky kind of thing. Now, this is a line. There's a fine line here because I believe in being relevant. I'm as excited about AI and all that stuff as you are, Carey, and I think there's ways for the church to take advantage of this. So there's ways of leveraging social media and messaging, and I love all of that. I'm pretty active on it. At the same time, what we don't want is to say we're just another in a long scroll of talking head influencers on, TikTok, Instagram, whatever. We can't just be another catchy, persuasive person. There has to be another reason to trust us. And it's one of the things, it's a bit counterintuitive because California is incurably future focused, and that's what makes California wonderful. We're focused on imagining new futures, ideation, and all of that. But I have found that actually the medicine that people are longing for is a retrieval of something ancient and something trusted. So, for example, I did a series on Proverbs, and I go, hey, here are life hacks from the richest man who ever lived in the ancient world. Like, wouldn't you like to know?
Yeah.
And I think. I'm not just trying to be cute. I'm trying to say what Scripture offers is time-tested wisdom from other ages that you don't have to say, is it going to last? Is it going to be here 5 years from now? And in a similar way, something like the Nicene Creed. We did a series on the Creed as well as a way of saying this is the core of what Christians believe. And that has helped because now I'm not saying, but trust me because I'm a good communicator or trust our church because we're cool. I'm saying trust something that has stood the test of time in lots of different countries and in lots of different eras. And it's bigger than you and it's bigger than me. And somehow people go, okay, actually, I'm looking for that.
So you're not pointing to your own authority. You're pointing to the authority of Scripture, the authority of the gospel, the authority of Christ.
The authority of Scripture, yes. The authority, and the witness to the global and historic church. I think it's helpful for people to understand when someone says, I don't like the church, or the church has failed, or the church, I always want to listen very carefully, and if there's trust there, to ask better questions like, tell me about the church you're talking about. And oftentimes it's one local church or even one a contemporary tradition of the church. And I want to help them zoom out and go, you know what? There's a global church. There's a historic church. And we're talking about a corner here where things have gone squirrely, and that's great. That's we have to take that seriously. But also, when we say we want to bear witness to a larger community, that's actually comforting to people to say this whole thing is not messed up.
What do you do personally as far as how you live your life, how you communicate, how you lead, to avoid, having credibility around the idea that you're not trustworthy? Right? Like, what are you doing I'm trying to live my life with integrity. I'm trying to do that privately and publicly. I don't always get it right, but I'd love to know like what you're doing so that it sort of even non-verbally sends the signal, it's okay here. You can trust me.
I think the only way I know to do this is to live close to people, to live in proximity with people. And I think for a lot of pastors, the instinct when you're not trusted is to retreat, is to go further away from people, to go out to your ranch, away from out of town and all that. And I get that seasonally, right, or occasionally. But my wife and I were in a small group with people in our church. We're in we're in other people's homes for meals. If people invite us over, we check the calendar. We try to make it work. I fill my week, not just with meetings with the staff, but with appointments with folks in the church. I'm out in the lobby, not in the green room. I'm not trying to be controversial or throw shade at anyone else. That's the only way I know to build trust, because I'm not going to borrow it from the institution or from the position or from my education. It's only going to be won through transparency and authenticity and proximity.
That's interesting. And you're not leading a church of 50 or 75. How many people would typically attend at a Rock Harbor weekend?
On a weekend it's 1,600, 1,700.
Yeah. So you've got lots of reasons to say, you know what, I'm not available. So you're making yourself available. The other thing you said that is really interesting about proximity, I mean, as we're recording this, our countries are not quite at war, but Canada and the US, there's a lot of headlines, right? Tariffs, and Canadians are getting very flexy about the maple leaf and about anti-Americanism because we feel threatened. And I've had numerous, and by the time this airs, this could all be over. But, I spent a lot of time in the United States. I get Canadians who pull me aside. It's like, oh, America, like what's happening? And you're there a lot. And how bad is it? I'm like, when I'm in the US, I like Americans. And it sounds an awful lot like you and me talking on this podcast. Like, guys, this is all floating above us. But if you really get down and you actually know, these are often people who haven't visited the US in 10 years. They don't know. But when you're there and you're across the border on a regular basis, it's super chill. It's like, these are just people connecting with people. And so you're saying there's a similar vibe when it comes to pastoring a local church, or flex on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison, Carey, because it is easy to sort of come up with conclusions or to use labels on a person or to sort people into tribes. I mean, we do this. Lots of people have written on this. Jonathan Haidt has written on this. Alan Jacobs has written on this. Like it's a shorthand that our brains need to sort people into categories and camps. But I think it's ultimately lazy work. And as a pastor, I just don't want to enable that. I don't want to give them fodder for that. I want to be close to them. Now, sometimes I'll admit I can get too anxious about it and I can go too far where I'm trying to be with everyone so that everyone can know I'm really a good guy. And there is a way that leaders can overdo it and you become overly anxious and trying to control everybody's perception of you, and you can't. But I want to live with integrity. Like you said, I want to be the same person, and I want to be with people so that they can know it. And what we want for our churches is that they become a close-knit community. Well, you know what close-knit communities do? They talk about each other, and there's a bad form of that, negative gossip. But you can gossip good news. I mean, marketing people call that buzz, right? You can gossip good news. And so if you're in groups with people and they go, man, I've really seen these guys, the way that they interact with their kids or with one another. That good news also spreads, and that's helpful in building trust.
Now, I imagine there's a threshold, right? Like you hear some negative chatter here or there. Do you have a threshold for what you tune out? Like what is acceptable bad frequencies, and then where it's like, okay, this deserves a response, or we need to reply, or we need to act. I'm wondering if you have, trigger's a loaded word, but like a trigger that makes you go, no, we'd take this seriously.
I think it all comes down to the source. So who's it coming from? So I'll never act with secondhand information. So if someone, this is what, Peter Steinke and others, this is the Friedman stuff about triangulation. When it's really between me and Susie, but Susie didn't tell me about it. Instead, Nancy told me about it. I'll go, well, I'm not dealing with that until Susie comes to talk to me about it. So it has to be firsthand, number one. Number two, the person needs to have a certain kind of reputation, character, relationship. So I take most seriously the people I trust most deeply. And so there are longtime stakeholders at Rock Harbor that when they're, and I've made a few bad decisions already in 2.5 years here, right? And some miscalculations of, a decision about a student ministry thing or a women's ministry thing. And when you make those decisions, you go, okay, wait a minute, let's invite them into a meeting. Let's have a conversation about this. What am I missing? And I'm always trying to close the distance. But one of the worst things leaders can do is to make decisions from a distance. We have to be so careful about that because we're not proximate to every situation. But either we need to trust then the people who are closest to the situation to make the decisions, or we need to close the gap so that we can make the decision. But I've seen too many leaders, especially large church leaders, who want to be the ultimate decision maker, but they're not. There's so much distance between them and the situation. They're not making great decisions about it.
It's so funny. I was smiling for those of you who are watching YouTube when you were saying it all boils down to who, because it brought me back to my lead pastor days. And I'm sure my staff some of them are still in therapy over this, but if they came to me and they said, hey, some people are saying, yeah, exactly.
No way, Carey.
My next word was, okay, Glenn, who? Mm-hmm. Who? Mm-hmm. And I would just keep going who until they either left my office and quit, and that was true. If I got stopped in the lobby and someone said, hey, people are not really happy. Well, like who? Mm-hmm. Is it you? Mm-hmm. Well, it's not me. It's just who. And that, and I said it in a nicer way than it sounds now. But when you really say, oh, good. Oh, so it's her. Oh, I'll have a conversation with her. Or it's him. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, tell him to come to me. Come directly to me. That shuts down gossip. And it even in a big church, like over 1,000, thousands of people, it'll shut down gossip because people know this isn't going anywhere. This isn't. So anyway, a little hack, try who. Yeah. Okay. And not like I'm taking names and these people are going to pay, but like, listen, we do not take anonymous threats here. We just don't. We don't negotiate that way.
You can't address a phantom problem. You can't fight a phantom enemy. You can't reconcile with the phantom enemy. We have to put faces and names and stories to this.
So you've done a lot of research over the last 5 years on the state of mental health. Tell me the moment. Was there a tipping point where you realized, like you already shared that one stat about drop in institutional trust, but was there a moment where you're like, oh, wow, this really is a crisis? And what was it? Take us to that.
So when we did the research a few years ago, we designed it around 8 challenges facing pastors. And I tried to name these 8 challenges as challenges that would have been true in probably every era, or at least the modern era of ministry. So 4 for the pastor as an individual, 4 for the church. The ones facing the church, those felt like, that's not surprising. We're always going to wrestle with how do we do our mission in the world and how do we, fight for unity and all of that. The 4 for the pastor, the one that really stood out to me was the challenge of relationships. I didn't expect so many pastors to actually say how lonely they were, or to say that they were that lonely. So just for comparison, so in 2015, 42% of pastors said that they either frequently or sometimes felt lonely. That it has increased in the last couple of years. 65% of pastors report feelings of loneliness and isolation. That's 2/3. 2/3 of pastors are dealing with a deep kind of loneliness and isolation. And I think many, just anecdotally now, when I did focus groups and then as I've traveled to do these roundtables around the country, even in the UK, what I frequently hear is, well, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know what to do about this.
About what? Loneliness?
About the loneliness, because they go, I just don't know if I can talk to anyone in my church, and I just don't know. I mean, and this is the thing about relationships in ministry, and maybe this will be helpful for some of your listeners to think of it this way. People in your church, whether they're on your staff or your eldership or your leaders or congregants, those relationships are not symmetrical. There's a bit of a power differential there. And so at the end of the day, you can't ever take off the hat of, yeah, I'm the guy who stands up or I'm the gal who stands up and preaches. So it's not symmetrical. But then secondly, they're not reciprocal. Sometimes they are. I mean, you might try to make it reciprocal, but odds are you're the person they'll call in a crisis, but you're not sure if they're the person you would call in a crisis. And I'm all for closing that gap again and leveling that out as much as you can. And I'm grateful for mature believers in our church where that gap really is closed. But I think for so many pastors, particularly young church planters, they go, I don't have mature people in my church. I have people who they're helping me plant the church because they have an ideal of what church can be, and they hope that
I'll make their dream.
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
Gonna crush them pretty quick.
So they don't have a safe place for that.
So what do you do about loneliness?
I have decided that I need a constellation of relationships. This is one of the most helpful insights I came across years ago, to not make the mistake of looking for one North Star, one wise mentor, one best friend, one North Star. No. Even sailors didn't navigate by a singular North Star. They used a constellation. And I think we need a constellation of voices, a constellation of relationships in our life. So I have playfully used the Lord of the Rings thing. You know, you need a Gandalf, you need a sage, maybe a few sages. You need an Aragorn, someone who's a truth teller and a no-sayer, a king type figure, a royal figure. You need some peers, people who are pastors like you, but in other contexts. You know, you need some friends like Merry and Pippin and Samwise, who will walk with you, but they don't actually know what it's like to do your job. And then you need a healer, which, in Lord of the Rings, like Arwen or whatever. It's someone who, that would be a therapist or a spiritual director or a counselor or a coach. So I have all 5 of those. I have people in my life that when I need profound wisdom, I'll reach them out and I reach out to them and go, hey, I need some insight about this. When we were at a crossroads about whether we should leave Colorado and step into this calling here at Rock Harbor, we called every sage we knew, and we're like, I'll buy you coffee, I'll buy you a Zoom call, let's do. So we have sages in our life. I have people in my life that can tell me no. But I'll tell you the biggest lifeline for me, it's the peers, other pastors in other parts of the country. So there's 3 other pastors. One is Rich Velotis in Queens, in New York City. One is a guy named Aaron Stern in Fort Collins, Colorado. And one is a guy named Sean Kennedy, who's in Alabama. Sean and Rich were college roommates. Aaron and I were longtime ministry associates in Colorado at one time. And the 4 of us have been on a monthly Zoom call for 8 years. 8 years.
Wow. And
it's a 60 to 90 minute Zoom call. We go around the horn. How's everybody? We talk about marriage. We talk about personal life. We talk about ministry. And then in between those Zoom calls, we're sending, the Marco Polo a video messaging platform, or we're texting each other. We're sometimes it's exchanging resources and best ideas, best practices. Sometimes it's, guys, I'm really struggling, mental health, and knowing that you don't have to give context behind it because they get it. That's the lifeline. And that's the piece I think most pastors are missing, is that peer relationship.
Well, and you knew each other before you became authors and pastors of larger or influential churches, which I think really happens. So, I mean, some of those names are known names. What would you say to the pastoring a church of 150 who's like, Rich Velotis probably isn't going to return my calls. Sure. What would you, and Rich would. Rich is nice. But yeah, okay, let's not throw Rich under the bus here on this podcast. Yeah, Rich is a super nice guy. But, for those of us who don't have well-known friends, and I did the same thing. Every major life decision I've made in the last 15 years, I've reached out to anyone that I thought was wiser than me, including in this season I'm in now, where I'm thinking about, the next decade and what's ahead. Man, that wise counsel is so valuable. So what would you say, though, to the person pastoring a church of 100, 150 who does not have access to, quote, famous people?
I don't think it's about famous people. And as you pointed out, I mean, Rich and I, yes, we do write and all of that stuff, but the friendship did begin before, we were doing those things, but it's more about longevity. So that's why he chose his old college roommate, and I chose a guy that I had known since I began ministry in my early 20s, Aaron Stern. And that those two bonds kind of made the dynamic work. So I would just say, think of the people that have known you before you were in the role you were in. Maybe it's someone you went to college with. Maybe it's someone you went to seminary with. Typically, some bit of history really helps. This is going to be maybe controversial. I love city pastor networks, and I'm in one, and I'm on the leadership team of it. So I say this carefully, and we're trying to help one another. But I don't think those are always the answer, because you're relating to one another with some edge of competition or rivalry or even comparison. So ideally, I think it works best if you are with people who are outside of your context.
Right, you're not fishing in the same pond.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've all seen the stat now for 3 or 4 years where, depending on the season, 30-ish% to 42% of pastors have given serious consideration to leaving full-time ministry, not quitting their day job, just like, I'm out, tapping out, I'm going to go sell cars, start another company, something like that. I would love to know from your perspective, because you are acquainted with that research and a lot of data around mental health. What are the factors that you think because I thought it would go away as soon as COVID went away. What's feeding that stat?
Well, Barna did follow up with pastors to ask them about it and to rank the stress, the factors in it. The number one factor, it's a bit of a catch-all, but the number one factor is the immense stress of the job.
Yes.
And I mean, Carey, this is the thing for pastors. It's very hard to explain to someone who's not in this seat. Now, I also want to be careful. There's CEOs, there's people who, actually the people that I found a lot of simpatico with is entrepreneurs and CEOs, because they get it. Because they also have to wear many hats, and have to function in areas where they don't actually have the competencies for it. They weren't actually trained for X, Y, and Z. So there are some overlap there. But I think what pastors mean by the immense stress of the job is the kind of stacking expectations that have happened. So it used to be, in one era, the pastor just needed to be a Bible expert. Then the pastor needed to be an organizational leadership guru. They needed to be able to write articles for Harvard Business Review. Then it was like, no, actually, they need to be trauma informed. They need to be, almost like a therapist, as they relate to people and as they talk about subjects. And then it's like, no, actually, they need to be social activists. They need to know exactly how to mobilize this community for volunteerism and engagement in the community. All of those things are justifiable and even good. But it's not as if those expectations have swapped out. It's that they've stacked higher. And so the pastor today has to be all of those things at once, in various modes. And I feel that. I feel there's parts of the job where,
you're a practitioner. So what do you do about that?
I mean, I feel that. I feel wait, I'm supposed to figure out how to run a campaign, a capital campaign, or I'm supposed to figure out how to do, I wasn't trained on donor development. I don't even know if I want to think of it as donor development, So I think what I feel a lot is not only those stacking expectations, but then I think, wait a minute, what's the Christian way to do this? So I'm wrestling with my own theological pressures in my own brain of is there what's the right way to do this? And so we're kind of riddled with this anxiety of there is a right and a wrong way, a Jesus way and a devil's way of going about these things, and we always want to do it right. So I think what's helped me, it's funny because I literally was journaling this morning. I have to remind myself repeatedly, I don't have to be awesome at everything. And I have to be willing to accept, I have to right size myself to the role and to say, I'm going to live with this. I'm going to be the best that I can. And I'm going to have a growth mindset and I'm going to try to get better. All of those things is true. But it's a false belief to think that I have to be awesome at everything. It's even, and I love, let's take something that I do feel, good about. I love preaching. I love communicating. But even so, I've taken off the false belief that every time I speak, it has to be brilliant. I got, you know what? It's okay. It's okay if it's not. It's okay if that was average, And some of that internal pressure, depending on how different people are wired, some of that's an internal pressure we're putting on ourselves. Some of it is external from the pastor. But I'll never forget Eugene Peterson years ago when he wrote about we have to teach people what a pastor is because people don't have a category for it. And I would go a step further and just say you have to teach people what kind of pastor you are. So you might be the and you can name the archetypes out there. You might be this kind of pastor. That's okay. Be the one that God has called you to be. Be the best, most faithful version of that you can, and then help people understand what they've got in you.
So I know you've only been at Rock Harbor for a couple of years, but prior to that, you were at a mega church and you were a campus pastor. So my question is, why haven't you quit?
Wow. Yeah. And the mega church I was at in Colorado, the founding senior pastor had a really public moral failure in 2006.
And you can say what it was.
Yeah, it was Ted Haggard. People will know that name. It was a long time ago. And then 13 months after that, in 2007, there was a shooting that happened on our campus, and 2 teenage girls lost their lives that day. So definitely hardship and transition and turbulence. I think the thing that has kept me is a community of friends. I was really, really fortunate to those years in my 20s and 30s to have been with people that we had known each other for a long time. We'd essentially grown up in adulthood together, getting married at the same time. Not everybody has that, but we had that gift. I think the other part of it that, maybe 12, 13 years ago, Carey, is recognizing that I have agency over more parts of my life than I thought. And this is the thing pastors don't get. So mental health, I did my doctoral work on hope and how Christians experience hope in the context of the rituals of worship and blah, blah, blah. But one of the pieces of that was about agency. When you study hope, even from a secular perspective, it's not possible to have hope without activating your agency. If people feel like they cannot act or they cannot change anything about their situations, you're immediately going to live in despair. I think so much of this depression, mental health crisis for pastors is we have convinced ourselves that we have zero agency over our lives. And that's just not true. There's so many things. You can adjust your schedule. You can adjust your workout. You can adjust who you meet with. And so my wife and I, 12, 13 years ago, we wrote this book. The book came out 2 years ago, but 12 or 13 years ago, we started doing this retreat and we called it the intentional year. And it was our way of saying, let's not be reactive. How can we put the big boulders in our schedule, so to speak? So what are the pieces we want to make sure we have? And even relationally, we would do this map of concentric circles and go, who are the people that we want to invest in intentionally? There's going to be margin for others that are asking us, and that's great too. But if we don't have some sense of, I'm going to intentionally choose rhythms in our prayer life, our rest, our renewal, our relationships, and our work, those 5 spheres. If we don't intentionally choose that, it will be chosen for us, and then we'll grow to resent it.
I'm concurring with you, and yet I got to ask on behalf of those. It's like, well, you don't know my board, Glenn. You don't know my congregation. They have expectations that I'm on call 24/7. I don't know that I have any agency. What do you say to that objection?
Send them this podcast. send them Carey, your show, and help them understand that you're not a machine. And if they can either have you for the long term, or they can have you for the short term with a spectacular failure and fracture, because all of this treasure that we carry is in earthen vessels, Paul said. And this is the thing we have to realize: Paul himself needed a community of people around him. Paul himself needed these places of recovery and strength. So I like to say resilience is really about 2 things. It's about recovery and it's about recalibration. And those are 2 different things. Recovery requires taking a assessment of your soul, of your seasons. We can talk about that. Recalibration is some of the things we've talked about. And so I would I would invite you to maybe just have that conversation with your board. Just say, hey, I need help. I need your help so that I can be the pastor you want me to be and that God has called me to be in the long term. But here's how I need your help. And those are powerful words to say, I need your help.
What about people who are afraid that they will appear weak when they say, I need your help, or I can't hack it. I can't do it. I don't have what it takes.
I do understand that. First of all, I relate to that. I spent a lot of years as associate senior pastor at that mega church in Colorado, and I led for 10 years a campus that was all live preaching, even contextualized. It didn't feel like a cookie cutter campus. We had a lot of leadership room. And yet, when I stepped into the role at Rock Harbor 2.5 years ago, I felt this immense pressure to prove that I could level up, And so I understand that. I understand that pressure from pastors to say, okay, you got to show that you can level up. I had a moment, Carey, about halfway through my first year at Rock Harbor where I was feeling that pressure, the weight on my chest. We had to meet year-end giving goals. We had to, and I knew there were some people who thought as soon as I came here, boom, the church was going to return to its glory days. And it grew, but it grew very steadily and incrementally, not exponentially. So I took a risk and I went to the chairman of our board and I said, can I be vulnerable with you for a moment? I said, I feel like you guys really want the church to be much bigger than it is now and that we're not getting there quick enough. And he just looked at me and he goes, Glenn, it never needs to be any better than it is right now. And I almost started crying. And he goes, of course we want to reach more people and all this stuff, but I just want you to know this is beautiful and it never needs to be any better than it is right now. And I felt the release. The vulnerability is a risk. And, we learned this from the 12 steps, from all of the recovery communities. You take that risk of confessing weakness, you'll actually find freedom on the other side of it.
Why did you choose the chairman of the board to talk to?
He was one of the key people recruiting me out here, so I knew he was for me. I knew he wouldn't weaponize that vulnerability against me. That's an important thing. And I knew he could do something about it, with the rest of the guys. So he did. He spoke to, and one by one, I started getting texts, or they'd pull me aside, go, Glenn, I heard that you're feeling this weight, brother. We love you. We're for you. And it just made I slept better at night.
I think there was such wisdom in that, because that is how I would. I always had great chairs of the board. We were very fortunate that way, but it makes intuitive sense to me to go to a person before you go to a board, because there's just wisdom in that, and then you know what you're going to face. So I think that's a really practical thing. All right, one of the stats that really has my heart, like when I read it, every time I see it, I just can't believe it. But when you look at the divide in every category, in the mental health of leaders over 45 and those who are under 45, if you're under 45, your mental well-being, your physical well-being, your social well-being falls off a cliff. Like the stats are a fraction for older leaders than they are for older leaders. Why?
Yeah, and I want to be clear that any answer I give here is more conjecture or theory than it is, borne out by specific data, because it's hard to get underneath this, except through focus groups. What a sociologist would say is, qualitative research. But I think we do have some of that in our conversations, and I think some of the factors are younger leaders are typically in the middle of a church plant. They're about years 3 or 4 or 5 in the church plant. So one of the reasons for this is the church planting era is very exciting. The first couple, maybe it's exciting because it's scary, But once you make it past year 3, you're like, okay, this thing's going to survive. But it's also when the people who planted with you are leaving. And there's lots of people who talk about this, or church planting agencies say, yeah, expect it. Because there's some people who are pioneers. They like to pioneer, but they're not infrastructure people. They're not builders. And once those people start leaving, that's really painful. And sometimes they leave because they're like, oh, I thought we were going to be this kind of church. It turns out we're just going to be an quote unquote ordinary kind of church, And
Right.
That's hard.
Right. Yeah.
And if you're a pastor, if you're a leader, that your motivating factor is to be unique or to be special, you're an Enneagram 4, that's like a death blow, man. When someone goes, oh, I see, we're just becoming a normal church now, And I
75 people setting up and tearing down every Sunday. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I think there's an expectation thing. I think there's the relational departure. But I think the other factor is younger pastors are they live in the digital world. They're spending hours a day on Instagram, and the danger here is you're comparing yourself with everybody else. And so it's you were not unhappy with your church until you scrolled Instagram on a Sunday afternoon while you're sitting on the couch, depleted and depressed, and now you're even more depleted and depressed. So that has to be a factor somewhere, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's a difference between pre-digital memory and no pre-digital memory. Like I can scroll Instagram or TikTok and I see big crowds or, podcasts with bigger numbers. And there's a part of me that's like, okay, like it's fine. But I lived for 30 years, 35 years before I really had that daily competition in my life. Is that a factor?
It's got to be. It's got to be.
Yeah.
I mean, digital natives, this is your window to the world. And
it's been there since you were 8, right? Like, So let's talk about that for a moment, because I have seen that, and that is a FAQ. I'm getting it less because I talk about it a lot on the podcast, so must be getting through. And we have a pretty young audience on this show too. But how do you cut through the noise of TikTok and Instagram and next-gen influencers?
Well, I don't know that you cut through the noise. I think there's a way to right-size the noise, to put it in its proper place. And again, this is where you need your people around you. You need real flesh and blood community around you who remind you that you're okay and what you're. So like me going to my elder and him saying it never needs to be any better or bigger than this. It right-sizes other voices that are in my head, or the voices that come from comparison. So there is an internal dynamic with that, where you right-size it in your own life by having real relationships. But there's an external part of this too, and this is the thing we're not talking about. Is it's not just pastors who are scrolling Instagram and TikTok; it's the people in our church.
Yes.
And so now, even if you're not comparing yourself against whatever popular preacher, they are, and they go, "Hey, I heard this guy say this, but you didn't say it that way," or "I heard this person put," and that. I don't know how you. That's one of the great struggles of the world we're living in. Again, competing voices in this cultural moment.
What is the biggest factor impacting, like right now, impacting pastoral resilience? The ability, whether you're a younger leader or an older leader, the ability to really make it. Because and let's even define resilience. I mean, Is it sort of the stereotypical, you get knocked down, you get back up again? Chumbawamba? Like, no? Sorry, had to do that.
I got the reference. I
get knocked down. Yeah, a certain age.
Yeah. No, it is both ends. So let's go back to those words, recovery and recalibration. It is recovery. There is something about recovery. And I want to say the biggest obstacle to recovery, that form of resilience, is that we don't slow down to actually begin to do that work. So when I talk to pastors about this, I say, let me give you a practical thing. Discern the condition of your soul. And they go, okay. And I go, here's 2 questions to ask yourself. Are you weary or are you wounded? Because those are not the same thing. Those are not the same thing. And if you are weary, then okay, let's talk about your schedule. Let's build in a summer break. That we can figure that out. If you're wounded, you cannot sabbatical your way into healing if you're wounded. You can't rest your way into wholeness if you're wounded. And that's it.
Wow.
So
I hadn't thought about that.
Too many young leaders are thinking rest is all they need, when actually you need healing. You need somebody, and it could be a trained therapist. It could be an intensive sort of thing. But I wonder, when I lived in Colorado, there were a lot of military folks that would come back from deployment. And PTSD, it doesn't show up typically when you're in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. It typically shows up when you're in line at Walmart or when you're in traffic on the freeway. Because it's the more normal things get, the more those things start to your body relaxes now. And the thing that it had had separated out because of adrenaline, it now has unleashed, and it's leaking out. And I think this is happening for a lot of pastors and church leaders. You took some shrapnel over those years of the pandemic and the racial tensions and political, you took some shrapnel, you made it through, and now things, quote unquote, feel normal. Attendance is more or less back or whatever. But it's in these moments where things feel normal that now all of a sudden the wounds appear, and you go, oh wait, I didn't know I was bleeding. I didn't know I was hurt. I didn't know that I had actually stopped trusting people. I didn't know that I was afraid to talk about race. I was, so are you weary or are you wounded? That's the condition of your soul.
I think, and I don't want to gender stereotype here, but the number of times over the years I've walked in the house after a day of yard work and my wife looks at me and goes, there's blood all over your leg. What happened? And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I have feeling, but
right.
You're just like, I didn't even know I cut myself. You're looking at your elbow, blood all over the place. I didn't even notice. And I think that's a metaphor for church leadership too. You're like, I'm fine.
Yes.
You're not.
And then you're not. Exactly. Then the second discernment question on the recovery bucket is to discern the season that you're in. I think, again, lesson from my father-in-law who farmed for 50 years in the Midwest, good work done in the wrong season is bad work. And you can't cut down firewood in the winter. I mean, think about it, you can't do that. So it's firewood, that's good work. Yeah, but it's the wrong season. And I think this is, again, the challenge with the social media thing. You may not be in the same season as the person that you're watching their video. So they're doing this and they're launching that. Maybe we should launch that. Maybe we should try. Maybe your church is not in that season, And so you have to not just discern the condition of your soul, you got to discern the context of the season that your church is in, and to say, if we're in a winter season, what does that mean for us? If we're in a spring season, what does that mean for us? And make your work match the season that you're in, or you're going to end up being really frustrated. I think older leaders know this. I think younger leaders have not learned it yet.
Yeah. And I mean, if you've been in ministry for 20 years, there's a stereotype of going to a conference and getting all excited about something and then coming back and, all right, this is what we're doing. And then you go to another conference and no, this is what we're doing. But you're right. Social media is just that. You get that 28 times a day.
Yes.
And so you probably haven't developed the discernment to get that yet. So I want to go 20 years into the future. We're in the mid-2040s, which sounds really weird. When we look back at this period in church history, what will we wish we had done differently?
I think, and this is something I'm really passionate about, I think we're going to wish we had rallied around the right things. I think we're going to wish that we had recovered some sense of the core of Christian belief. And this is what has been a project of mine for a number of years now, is a retrieval by learning from other eras of church history. So when I think about eras of church history where there were rapid growth, but also sort of this tribalized kind of thing, the church began to say, hang on, we need some unifying calls here. We need some ways of kind of reminding ourselves of what lies at the heart. What are the defining pieces? And I think I think as denominational loyalties fade, and some of that we can embrace the good of that, there needs to be something else now. So now what unites us? Now what pulls us together? People aren't getting together like they used to because we're all Presbyterians or we're all it's just those loyalties are not there, for better or for worse. And so rather than let it become feudal little encampments that's just going to fuel our isolation. It might even fuel the lack of accountability. We need we need networks of facilitated peer learning, and we need creeds and confessions that return us to the core.
You argue that Christianity has been co-opted or corrupted in the last few years. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think this is precisely the thing we're trying to name, with the different voices out there. And maybe, part of this is in the scandals, and you see that the church has been plagued by scandal after scandal after scandal. I think part of this is, a number of one of the reasons why so many young people have become disillusioned with the church. I saw someone put it this way. They said, it's not that I stopped believing these things. It's that I realized the people I respected don't actually believe these things,
Hmm.
and that's why people are wanting to walk away from church or walking away from faith. So corrupted by our own failures, co-opted by our own agendas. And we could think about, in America, we could think about the various ways and various degrees of nationalism or political tribalism that has gone in. And I'm not talking about people having political opinions. You can have political opinions. You can have a love of country. But there's a line that we cross where we go, God is on our side, or every Christian ought to think this way, and you start to theologize your politics, or you start to theologize your preferences. That is really undermining the faith, because now we're adding extra elements to the core of what Christianity is about. And I think, it leaves people in the church and outside the church just wondering, man, what's a Christian anyway? You just keep adding stuff.
Well, there is a real fusing, and I've seen it intensify since the election last year, of ideology and theology, of partisan views and politics and faith. And pastors have become very vocal about it. And I don't think that they see the distinction anymore. They're like, this is what it's been about all along. What are your comments on that phenomena? First of all, are you seeing it? And if so, what's at stake there?
I'm definitely seeing it. And there's part of me that's on my best days trying to be charitable and sympathetic to what they're trying to do, If you press me, I would say, I actually think a Judeo-Christian worldview happens to be a really wonderful soil for the things that we love about Western civilization. I do think that's true historically, so I understand it. I think the difficulty here is, okay, so what does that mean then for the church's mission in the world? And that's maybe the step that some are taking, where they go, well, therefore it means we ought to be active in this way, and we ought to vote this way, and we ought to, and you go, well, what if I share your biblical convictions, but I don't share your political actions, or the outworking of those convictions? And that's where I think it becomes problematic, because now, again, when you don't have something to hold on to, you've replaced then. This is why I was saying we need a core creed or confession to hold fast, because when you don't have that, absent of that, we're going to latch on to something else. And what we've latched onto is partisan political ideology.
Yeah, and I think people who would be, in that mold, who have fused their partisan theology, if you can put it that way, would say, well, what alternative is there? Like, they have drunk the Kool-Aid. And so, Glenn, what is the alternative? You going to be a wishy-washy liberal? What are you going to be?
I think the alternative is to do what Christians in every age have done. It's to give our allegiance to King Jesus, to let the church be an alternative community, a small working model, as N.T. Wright puts it, a small working model of the kingdom of God, and then to let that bleed outwards to where we do try to call the powers of this world into account in some small ways. The ways that we've been given in a Western liberal democracy, where we're allowed to kind of influence. I think some of that's okay. But I think when we confuse that as central to our mission, what is really more peripheral to our mission, I think that's where the confusion comes in. Because then people go, well, so then to be a follower of Jesus, do I need to do all those things, or do I need to do these things? What am I saying yes to? And now we've undercut the core of our mission.
So what does that look like at Rock Harbor? How are you trying to not get swept up in the culture wars? What are you focusing on?
We're focusing on the kingdom of God. We're focusing on what it looks like to faithfully love one another, to be a different kind of church. We did this thing the Sunday before the election. I wrote out a prayer, and the prayer was, for our nation, and the prayer was for leaders to do the right thing and all of that. The prayer was for wisdom, and courage for all of us to use our voice in a way that protects people and loves our neighbor and all of that. But the prayer also included, but at the end of the day, Lord, help us to be the church that is the instrument in the world. And I think we have to remember that it is a lesser gospel to believe that the machinery of the state can accomplish the mission of God. That's a lesser gospel. The true gospel is that the instrument of the church, the feeble earthen vessel of the church, is meant to be the vehicle of the kingdom arriving on earth as it is in heaven. And anything else, it's good if you have it, good if it's fine if you don't. But to get confused about it, that's a lesser gospel.
Glenn, is there anything we haven't talked about today that you would love to talk about?
We've been alluding to this kind of swirl and this blizzard and something to hang on to. One of my favorite metaphors that's become so powerful to us, our community here at Rock Harbor, is this image of a blizzard in the old Midwestern days when the farm prairie days. The storm would get so bad that in order to find your way home, you had to go out to the barn to do some chores, close things up, whatever. They would put a rope up between the house and the barn. And it's just like, you shouldn't need it because you know this distance, but yet that's how blinding the blizzard was, that you needed a rope just to help you find your way home. I think the early Christians, the early followers of Jesus put up a rope for us, and that rope is the Nicene Creed. And the Nicene Creed, it's not just an outline of theology. No. The Creed it has always been a unifier. It reminds us of what's at the heart of our faith, our belief in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Giver of life. But the Creed is not just a unifier, it's a purifier. And this is why I believe it's so powerful for us as pastors today. It reminds us that this is the core, and if we could not just believe these words, but live like these words are true, this is part of our hope for the church finding its way. And so whether it's the swirl of TikTokers or Instagram influencers, or whether it's the church being corrupted or co-opted, we did the series at Rock Harbor 2 years ago, and it was incredibly life-giving to people because they began to realize, so amidst all these voices of vague spiritualities or whatever, or even loud Christians taking shots at one another, friendly fire, all the stuff that we've talked about today, they realized, okay, so this is it. This is the irreducible minimum, but it's not just an irreducible minimum. It's the gateway into the most beautiful mystery of all, the life of who God is and what it looks like to be his people. So I wrote What's a Christian Anyway about that, about what it means to not just believe these words, but live like these words are true. And I feel like it's a great follow-up for the challenges of credibility and confusion and all the stuff that we've been talking about.
Well, Glenn, this has been a really rich conversation. I had a couple of huge insights myself. So I'm going to be listening back, taking notes. Your latest book is called What's a Christian Anyway? Also, highly still recommend The Resilient Pastor. We've been talking a lot about resilience. It is still needed. Tell us about where people can find your books. Obviously, Amazon, everywhere, but a little bit about where they can find you too.
Well, I would love if people went to what'sachristiananyway.com. What you'll find there is a little bit of information about the book, links to buy it. But honestly, for pastors and church leaders, I think one of the best things we could do is to give our people something better to hold on to than the lesser gospels and lesser promises. So for anyone who orders 5 or more of these books, I'm giving away, it's like 20 pages worth of my sermon outlines for this series. So you could do an entire sermon series on this. I'm giving away my outlines. I've just taken out some of the personal stories, but all the illustrations and the scriptures are there. Sermon outlines. We're giving away discussion questions for small groups. We're trying to do all that. So what'sachristiananyway.com would be the best place to find all that.
I'm laughing because I've heard cases and been the victim of cases where people do tell the personal stories of other people as though they were there. So it's a good thing you deleted those, Glenn. All right.
Good. That's good.
Great. So that's what'sachristiananyway.com?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Glenn, till next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Carey.